Kill Bill Part 1, a movie review. So this is part of my scripted review series where I go through kind of old blog posts where I've written movie reviews in the past and kind of turn them into YouTube video reviews. So Kill Bill I wrote a lot about back in 2003 on the blog, partly because I was living in Japan at the time and the movie had a Japan theme. You know, you remember Kill Bill Part 1, a lot of it took place in Japan, used Japanese actors and actresses. I had a lot of kind of Japanese-esque stuff going on. So it was interesting kind of being in Japan and seeing this movie. And I talked a lot, maybe too much, about the relationship between Japanese people and Hollywood. So Japanese people they really like American movies. I guess everybody really likes American movies. Japanese people are also very self-conscious about the way the rest of the world sees them, or they're very interested in the perceptions of Japanese people abroad. So you would think that whenever an American movie came out that had anything to do with Japan, people would be very interested in it. They're not always, they don't always seem to be, or they don't, how to describe this? It's a little bit tricky to kind of put your finger on the pulse, especially because, you know, as kind of, when you're living in Japan, there's a temptation to say, Japanese people are like this, or Japanese people do this, or everyone's like this. And I certainly am guilty of that. I fell into that trap when I was writing that blog in Japan. But in reality, you're just kind of talking about like the 5 people you talk to that week. The people immediately around you, or the people that you know well enough to kind of have these conversations with. To kind of talk about what all Japanese people are like, even after a couple years in the country, which is what I was at that point, is a little bit dangerous to put your finger on. That being said, my impression is that they were interested in this kind of Kill Bill movie, but not quite as interested as I would have expected, kind of given the fact that they are very interested in American movies in general and very kind of conscious about the way Japanese people are perceived. So I kind of explored that paradox a bit on the original blog post I wrote about this, and I don't really think it's worth reading out, to be honest, because I just kind of talk about it in circles. I do mention that the Asian characters in American movies are either kind of stereotyped or as the villain, and that in Kill Bill they did appear kind of stereotyped in the villain. So, you know, maybe that was one reason why this movie wasn't quite as popular in Japan as you would think it would be. And I say, I get it that this is a satire, you know, like they're wearing those Kato masks and everything so over the top, so it's supposed to be a satire. I said, I get that, but, you know, it still might kind of explain why there wasn't quite so much interest. And then the next day after posting that, I was talking to a friend, a British guy who also lived in Japan. And he's like, well, what are you talking about? He's like, this has been on TV all week. People are so psyched about this movie. Quentin Tarantino's been on Japanese game shows. And I'm like, oh, I never saw any of that. I got rid of my TV the third year I was in Japan. Just gave it to a friend because I was worried I'd been watching it too much. So then I had to write another blog post saying, okay, maybe I should take this back. Maybe I was wrong the first time. And by the way, don't listen to anything I say ever, or always take me with a grain of salt. So I went back and forth on that a fair amount. I'm just going to skip over that and just kind of read some of the things I wrote about the movie in general. So about the movie in general. Actually, it was a little too violent for my taste. Although if I think about it, Tarantino's movies have always been violent, huh? I mean, that scene in Reservoir Dogs when the cop gets his ear cut off and then is doused with gasoline. Boy, that scene was not easy to watch either, was it? But there was enough clever stuff in that movie to make me overlook it and want to not only watch that movie, but rewatch it. I mean, I've seen Reservoir Dogs a few times now. I thought in Kill Bill, a lot of the cleverness was gone, and just the violence was left. But if you want to disagree with me, send me an email or comment below. Yeah, talk about the soundtrack. Also, I assume in American theaters all the Japanese was subtitled. In the Japanese theaters, the English was subtitled, but the Japanese dialogue was left unsubtitled. So it was a bit of a struggle for me to catch it, actually. But I have been studying Japanese, and I'm fairly pleased with how much I was able to catch, if I can just pat myself on the back. Okay, so then I did a second blog post in which I kind of took back some of what I said earlier about it not being a big deal in Japan and saying actually it has been a big deal in Japanese media. And then I add also, and this is interesting, apparently the Japanese version of Kill Bill contained some scenes that were deemed too violent for American audiences. Specifically, I'm given to understand that the animation sequence was longer and more violent in the Japanese version. Also, the climatic fight scene at the end, apparently that was black and white in the American theaters. Is that right? It was in color here in Japan. And apparently it was twice as long, with again more blood and violence than the American version. So maybe that's why I was complaining about the violence in my previous post. If you read that previous post and you thought, boy, he's getting a bit squeamish in his old age, isn't he? I saw this movie and I didn't think the violence was that bad. Then this is possibly because we saw two different movies. By the way, I did kind of double check this on the internet, and I think that's not wrong. The Japanese theatrical version was a lot different than the American theatrical version. Anyways, this brings me to a bit of social commentary. Do you remember the movie Bowling for Columbine when Michael Moore makes the point that it's kind of silly to blame violent media for violent crime in America, when Europe and Japan have the same violent media and only a fraction of the violent crime? It was a good point, I thought. And this is another good example. And yet another good example is the Japanese film Battle Royale, which was a huge hit in Japan. But because of the graphic depictions of high school students killing each other, no major distributor in the US would touch it, and it was essentially unreleasable in the US. And yet it was a huge hit in Japan, and Japan has barely any violent crime. And violent crime in the US is off the charts. Just some food for thought. Yep. And then I posted an update. Since I originally posted this, I did some surfing around online and confirmed what my friends had told me. Indeed, as mentioned above, the Japanese version is more violent and bloody. You can surf the net and see for yourself if you like. I found conflicting reasons given online why this was so I'm not sure which one is accurate. But either, number one, it was trimmed down to secure an R rating in the US, or number two, it was decided the Japanese audiences could handle the extra blood and gore better. One or the other. Okay,